Thank you very much, Mr. Katachin. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the conference series City of Differences, organized by Fiorenza Gamba, Sandro Katachin, and Nerea Alzola. We would like to say that it's in the frame of the Institute of Sociological Research at the University of Geneva. So we're pleased to welcome you at the second conference, which theme is going to be urban living and diversity. We have the privilege to hear from our guest speaker, Eveline ALTHAUS, who's gonna talk to us about city architecture and on the perspective of social housing, which is a multidisciplinary phenomenon.
And I will present Eveline ALTHAUS a bit more precisely. She's a social scientist at ETHZ World Forum, HTHKs, and Interdisciplinary Research Center on Architecture, Society and Built Environment, based on both theoretical and practical approaches. After her studies in social and cultural anthropology at the University of Fribourg and the Humboldt University of Berlin, she was researcher at Bern University of Applied Science Institute for Social Work. In 2015, she completed her PhD at Department of Architecture at Zurich. As a social anthropologist and housing researcher, she puts her research focuses on social and cultural aspects of housing, intergenerational co-living, aging in place, high-rise and large-scale housing, neighborhoods research, house biographies, poverty and social inclusion, participation, migration and diversity. She works with qualitative and experimental research methods. And Eveline is also a project leader of different research projects. For instance, and since 2006, the research network Age, Housing, Environment. She also directed another project, the Inner Swiss project, Growing Old at Home, from 2016 to 2019, and that focused on the challenges, opportunities, and options for housing providers to supply age-appropriate housing and to deal with an elderly and aged tenant population. Among her publications, we find Sozialraum Oschhaus, a book of the neighborhood and daily life in Swiss high-rise residential buildings. Published in 2018, this work sheds a light on socio-spatial dynamics and experimental difference otherwise than through preconceptions.
So let me introduce now to our discussant, and she is Nerea Viana Alzola. She graduated with a bachelor degree in political sciences at the University of Napoli. She also graduated with a Asian Studies Master in the University of Geneva. She's now a research assistant in sociology in the University of Geneva and is now working on her PhD, which is in the frame of an international research project called Unexpected Inclusions, Migration, Mobility, and Open City. It is led by Sandro Katachin, Fiorenza Gamba, and Marco Martinieri. The aim of the project is to analyze self-organized migrant associations, independent civil society initiatives, and establish ritual practices outside of the formal policies of migration and integration. So everything from the bottom up that would lead to togetherness and integration and collaboration. Eveline, we're all ears.
Thank you so much for this kind introduction. Very, very nice to hear me. Sometimes my voice is not the strongest, otherwise you come forward. And do you see the slides also? Yes. Yeah, it's nice to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation, also Sandro. yeah, this talk has a bit urban living and diversity. It's a bit all and nothing. I put another title below, living together with differences, and that's what I would like to speak about. Differences are a constitutional part of city life. That's what it's all about in this forum. And in this specific conference, I would like to explore ways of living together with differences in specific housing context, also because I'm mainly doing housing research. So let's see if this, yeah, it goes. My main question is, how are people dealing with differences in neighborhoods and in neighborly relations? And for discussing this, I put my focus on the smallest urban scale, namely on the level of residential houses or housing estates and their immediate surroundings. In my talk, I would first like to make a few conceptual considerations and then present you some findings from research projects that we actually carry out on this topic at our research center at the moment. I will focus on two research contexts. On the one hand, on large-scale housing complexes of the 1960s and 1970s, the topic on which I also did my PhD. And the other is on intergenerational co-living projects. It's quite a recent project that we just started last year. And to make it easier to bring these two different research contexts together, I will use the frame of your forum, of the topic of your forum, and really focus on differences, on this question of differences and how people deal with socio-cultural or age-related differences in these settings. So there are many conceptual approaches about neighborhoods or about neighborliness. Neighborliness is the English term for the behavior of people regarding interactions and relations among neighbors. And here I just want to give a few conceptual spotlights that I find either inspiring or that I also find important because they have a resonance until today. And also because it's a sociological forum, I went back to my sociological knowledge and went back to the history of sociology with Ferdinand Tönnies, for example, that conceives neighborhoods as one of three forms of community. The other two would be kinship and friendship. And he described neighborhoods with terms such as proximity, proximity of residence, social cohesion, being connected with each other, knowing each other, and he associated this also explicitly with images of pre-industrial rural life in villages. And this can be understood, of course, in the context of the then strongly growing cities at the time, and also with the perceived problems that went along with these urbanization dynamics. Conceiving neighborhood as a community has not only been influential within sociology then, just let's think about the Chicago school, but also for urban planning, with the focus on building neighborhoods as smaller units within larger urban contexts. And this understanding is also influential in what people expect of neighborliness until today. In general, the term neighborliness is associated with solidarity, help, and interdependence, at a local level. And going back also here to a classical sociological reference, Max Weber defined neighborly relations as any fixed or ephemeral commonality of interest due to spatial proximity. And he also emphasized that people are solidary with each other because they are also dependent on each other. He said that neighbors are the typical emergency helpers, and that also people in power positions find themselves in situations in which they have to rely on the goodwill of those around them, those living close by. He also observed that people living close to each other in dense residential blocks are keen to keep some distance because also of the spatial proximity. And in neighborly relations, it's important to balance between proximity and distance. This comes in all the literature about neighborliness. So both are important. Everyday encounters and solidarity networks on a local level, but also strategies to keep some distance to one's neighbors, also to deal with this proximity that we often did not choose when we live next to other people. And this can also prevent conflicts. So taking into account differences as a constitutional part of urban life, as you do in this conference series, leads to an understanding that moves beyond the idea of a neighborhood as a singular social spatial entity or as a singular local community. When we refer, for instance, to Martin Olbrow, also a sociologist, he emphasizes that in a specific place of residence there are countless individual realities and social figurations that are coexisting, without that a singular local culture or community needs to be generated. And such an understanding also takes in consideration the fluid, changing and hybrid character of identities and group memberships, as has been described by many sociologists and many anthropologists in the last decades, such as, for example, Gerard Delanty, Nina Glick-Schiller, or Floya Antias. And I would say, just if I use now the words neighborhoods or community, I also relate to this understanding, this relational and open understanding. So just having these conceptual considerations in the back, I would now like to move forward to some of our research findings that I would also like to share with you in this lecture. Large-scale housing of the 1960s and 1970s are in the focus of the actual, also in the focus of the actual research project PUSH, Public Space in European Social Housing, that we are carrying out with colleagues from university in Napoli, Copenhagen and Oslo, of which each university team is doing their own case studies. Our focus from all of us is on the public and collective spaces in these estates. And we from ETH, we are doing 2 case studies, which I will briefly just introduce in a moment. In the project, just important maybe to say, we are working with qualitative research methods, such as document analysis, qualitative interviews with different actors, and on-site observations. We are also working with mapping and visual documentations, and we were collaborating in school and community projects. This also a bit because of the COVID pandemic that led us to think about other ways of doing research. And we use exhibitions as a research tool in which we elaborate specific topics for each case to then discuss and compare with the other cases, and to also show the result, that are preliminary results, to a broader public. Maybe just to travel now to Bern, to just a few key data on the first of these case studies. It's in Charnergut in Bern. This estate was built in the late 1950s and early 1960s in Bern West. And it was one of the first high-rise housing estates in Switzerland, and the first in Bern. In the context of the economic boom and population growth at the time, the development was the answer also to an acute housing shortage. The city and the planners, they wanted to create affordable housing for low to middle income families, and after Charnergut, 5 other similar high-rise housing estates have been built in the immediate surroundings. In Geneva, you have similar examples also, like Le Lignon, Les Arranchés, very interesting examples as well. There are nearly 1,200 flats in 5 high-rise buildings and 8 blocks. Today, 2,563 residents live here. In the beginning, it was almost double that number because also mainly families with children were moving in the beginning. The population in Charlergut is very international. 42% of the residents don't have a Swiss nationality. The amount of people with a migration biography might be higher, as we don't know how many people also gained the Swiss citizenship. Also striking is the high proportion of older residents. Almost 4 out of 10 people are over 65 years old, and there is also an above average number of children and young people living in the estate. And just also a brief overview on the second case study. The Telly is located in the town of Aarau. And this high-rise estate was built over a relatively long period of time. And the reason was that the initial construction company, the Caretakers was called, which was also a landowner, this went bankrupt after the oil crisis, and then new owners had to be found. And in the 1,258 apartments, it's the largest estate in German-speaking Switzerland, there are live around 2,000 people. And this is almost every 10th person in Aarau that lives in these 4 blocks. In Telly, we also have a very international population with 55 different nationalities living here, and we also can observe demographic aging here with an above average number of older residents, a number that was also growing constantly in the last years. So the way people live together is also shaped by the decisions that have been made in the planning of the estates. A difference in the 2 cases is, for example, the mix of apartments. In Charlergut, that was built more than 10 years before Telly, 70% of all apartments have 3.5 rooms, and the layouts of the flats are quite small and non-flexible. And in Telly, we can observe a more balanced mix of apartments. The planners might also already have learned something from previous experiences, and the floor plans are also slightly more flexible, as, for example, in renovations, the kitchen walls can be removed, which also allows to create larger living rooms with kitchens. Both Charlergut and Telly have been planned and built with large green outdoor spaces, with a variety of facilities such as playgrounds, but also benches and tables where people can meet, sports and football fields, picnic areas, little petting zoos, paddling pools, or sledging hills. And both neighborhoods are car-free, which with only pedestrian paths, which also makes it a child-friendly environment. And for the planners and the architects in both estates, it was important that families and children find a good living environment and different opportunities to play and meet each other outside their homes. And both estates have also been planned with facilities needed for daily use for living, such as shopping centers, restaurants, school and childcare facilities. And they have also been planned with community centers as well as a variety of different indoor communal spaces. The community centers are open houses that have multi-purpose leisure and meeting rooms, and also a cafe. And the community center in Charlergut, which was the first of its kind in Switzerland, was planned with crafts and wood workshop, sports hall and a library. And Telly was built with a communal kitchen and also a kind of a bowling hall. From the first days up to present, these community centers have been led by professional community workers who are in charge of also running the centers, but also strengthening the neighborly networks and relations in these neighborhoods, and also empower individuals to get involved in local initiatives or help each other. Like, for example, during the COVID pandemic, they immediately build up these help networks, which also have been used a lot. For the maintenance and renewal of the buildings and collective spaces, the owners are of crucial importance. In Charnerwood, there are 4 non-profit owners which are tied together in a public company called TIAC, which is also responsible for the construction, maintenance and renewal of all common buildings and facilities of the neighborhood. And the city of Bern is responsible for the green outdoor spaces and also the school and childcare facilities that are there present on site. And in comparison to Charnerwood, Tallinn has a really complex ownership structure. The 2 middle blocks, they are owned by a large insurance company, and the first and the last block are owned by several institutional investors, but partially also by the municipality and housing cooperatives. And more than 1/5 of all the apartments are belonging to homeowners. So, in contrast to Charnerwood, each property owner is responsible for the outside spaces of the green spaces on their parcel of land and the facilities that are there. And this complex ownership structure also complicates when it's about dealing with common spaces. The 2 blocks that are owned by the single institutional investor, they are fundamentally being renovated at the moment, and they have already gone through renovation cycles. And the oldest block, that belongs to many different owners, also among which many homeowners, has not been renovated so far. And a few years ago, the renovation of a playground that was belonging to this parcel of land of this block turned out to be a really, really difficult and also a conflictive endeavor. So, when we speak about the maintenance and care of these neighborhoods, we should not forget the caretakers and cleaners that also play a very important role. Littering and waste are big issues in both estates, and these people, they clean and tidy up daily. They also repair things and are responsible for the house technology. And by doing so, they also make that these places work and continue to work. Caretakers are also approachable for the residents and often help with little gestures, such as repairing something or also having some chats, which for older and maybe also lonely people can be really important. But they are also, by establishing order, of course, they're also exerting control in these estates. What is particular in estates such as Charnerwood and Tallinn is a discrepancy between outside and inside perspectives. And in the outside perspective, it is quite common to think of high-rise blocks as anonymous structures. And for our case studies, and this is also a finding of my PhD, we can really say that this is a cliché, as we could observe a lot of different interactions and a broad spectrum of neighborly contacts in these settings. Of course, not everyone knows each other, but greeting each other, conversations and little chats when meeting or borrowing things or helping in everyday situations like taking care of each other's kids or pets and plants when in holidays, or also up to visiting each other, are quite common. And there is also quite a lot of people who are more than neighbors and have friendships and extended families in the neighborhood. Also because there are always available flats again, so people tend to also say, hey, I have a flat, and they build a friendship or family networks. That common interests and life situations foster contact is broadly described in neighborhood research, and we can confirm this. In both cases, there are old residents who know each other and maintain contacts for many years. And children, of course, also, they play a very, very important role, as they quickly come in contact with each other and then also can connect adults with each other. And these connections then are sometimes also maintained after the kids have left the homes. So residents in interviews often say that the optional character of the social contacts makes up the quality of high-rise living. They say, well, we can have contacts if we want to. It's quite easy to get to know someone here, but we don't have to, and that's actually what we like. And of course, community work, as I mentioned before, plays an important role in this regard, because it's also there to create these opportunities that people could meet if they want to, and also opportunities for participation. If we look at the social demographic data, we can see that the parallel dynamics of demographic aging and increasing internationalization can pose a challenge. So I would like to go a bit on this topic. In public view, these estates are often problematized because of the high amount of migrants living there. But if you change the perspective a bit, these neighborhoods can also be seen as an expression of our post-migrant society. The concept of post-migrant societies, as conceived, for example, by Naika Furatan or Errol Yildiz, is looking at how our society is dealing with migration. And in particular also, it is an invitation to us also to acknowledge that migration is an everyday reality, a reality of which we are all part of, and from which we ultimately also all benefit from. So neighborhoods like in Charnwood and Telly therefore can be seen in the context of such negotiation processes for recognition of migration and diversity. And it has to be said that people with migration biographies have been a constitutive part of the social demographic of these estates from the very beginning. They have come in the beginning mainly from Southern European countries, Southeastern European countries also, and over time this population has become increasingly diversified, also in line with the migration flows to Switzerland, with residents today coming from all over the world, and especially also from conflict areas of the global south. So in the interviews with residents, we can observe different strategies to deal with migration-specific diversity. Some emphasize that living in a multicultural area is an enrichment and makes up the special character of their neighborhood, and others consciously distance themselves also from their neighbors of other backgrounds or from some features of their neighbors, and emphasize also the differences. And in some statements, we could also testimony direct or hidden form of xenophobia. And all these different approaches focus on differences and can thereby also produce or reinforce differences. And there are also essentially statements of the nature of other cultures, such as the Spanish just have this culture, or the Turks are all like this. And often these statements, they are also not only transporting stereotypes, but they are also equating culture with nationality or ethnicity. But just now looking also at the interview material, we could also observe resistance against such reductive ascriptions, and people who also emphasize the diversity within the so-called culture. For example, by telling about differences they perceive with other people of the same origin. In this regard, they also take in account the fluid and hybrid character of group memberships, as I mentioned before. And quite common is also that people in these discourses also move away from differences and emphasize universal similarities, which can be recognized in statements such as, well, ultimately it depends how someone is and not where someone comes from, or as people, ultimately we are all the same. And as mentioned, community workers have the mission to strengthen these local social networks in these settings. And now with regard to the post-migrant context, the community centers also organize events and activities by and with migrant groups. And in some of these events, cultural diversity is consciously celebrated with food, performances, or dances from other cultures. And by doing so, these events often also adopt cultural essentialist images and therefore also reinforce differences. I just heard that Nerea is absolutely on this topic, and for sure you can tell a lot about that also afterward. At the same time, community work often is also committed to make migration experiences visible and also to advocate for migrants. Also responding also openly to widespread populist polemics against migrants that are also widespread in these areas. So in Cali, the Neighborhood Association, for example, they have completely reformed themselves a few years ago, also in order to represent migrants and to include them better into the participation structures of the neighborhood. Before it was really a bit an old man white club. I would like to say just a few words on the perspectives of children, and if it interests you, I would invite you to watch the short film on this Vimeo link. I'm sure you will get the presentation. It is a little project that we did with the school class in Charnergut in collaboration with Rathaus Theater Bern and the filmmaker. And in this project, also because we realized in the interviews it's difficult to get the perspectives of kids, and that's why we also approached the school. And we wanted to discover also and see and portray the Charnergut with the children from different angles. And what is really striking, that for the children, migration-specific diversity and multilingualism is the norm in these schools. Also within family structures, as there are quite a lot of binational families. And when you listen to the children, in contrast also to the discourses of many adults, there is no problematization of migration-related diversity. And they also often have a very light-hearted approach to differences. So we could also here, you can observe different narratives. Some statements connote the origin of the parents or grandparents and the migration-specific diversity in the neighborhood positively. And in other statements, children mention their own affiliation beyond the origin of their parents and highlight also their belonging to the neighborhood. And what we could also observe is that children often focus on commonalities with other children and or also on personal characteristics that maybe might differ from others, such as interests or hobbies. And by doing so, they also distance themselves from cultural essentialist ascriptions of differences. And I think we could really learn a lot from these kids. So that's why I also quite like the outcome of this film. If you allow me, I think we still have some time. I now do a cut. And we go in this completely other research context about intergenerational co-living. This is a practice-oriented applied research that we do together with colleagues from the University of Applied Sciences in Bern and with Age Research. And in this research, we focus on the questions how intergenerational co-living projects develop over time, from the initial ideas to the implementation and today's everyday life. So for doing so, in a first step, we did a documentation of 19 housing projects last year. And the result of this documentation is a booklet in German that you can read in German. And we published it last December. In the next step, we now started with case studies in which we work with different qualitative research methods as well. We are also doing workshops and field trips with practice partners, and they're planning also to do an accompanying film, if we get the funding for the film. Always a question. So these housing projects, in a way, can be seen as social innovators, as they usually try to find sustainable solutions on actual demographic, environmental, social or economic challenges that we face. And I think these quote by Annette Spellerberg, is a German sociologist, housing sociologist, puts that quite well. So how can intergenerational co-living projects be characterized? Generally, it's a housing form that actively promotes intergenerational and community-oriented neighborly relations in its planning and in its operation. It's also a housing form in which a specific age-related social mix is deliberately intended and planned, and not a byproduct, as usually happens when people of different generations live next to each other. Maybe important to say is that in our research sample we also included projects with only a partial and often not intended mix of generations, like house communities for people in the second half of life. As this target group, 50 plus, let's say, also includes different generations. We started our research with an inventory of existing intergenerational living projects in Switzerland. Here we also included the Romandie as far as we could understand. We got in touch with organizations here. And we were looking at projects that were realized up to 2017, because we are interested in the longer term everyday experiences of people in such projects. That's why we didn't include in this inventory any newer projects. And the idea of intergenerational co-living got very popular in the last years. In our inventory, a large part of the projects have been initiated after 2010, and many are also planned or constructed today. And I want to give you just an idea which kind of projects we are speaking of, and that's why I also would like to present you two projects of the 19 of our documentation. This is the Serai in Winterthur. It's a multi-generational house. It was planned and built from 2005 to 2013 in Winterthur. It is a project that was initiated by a group of people that were looking for an alternative also intergenerational form of living, and they joined forces together with Gesebo, that is a cooperative for self-managed housing in Winterthur. And from the very first idea until today, everything is organized and managed by the residents themselves. They organize themselves in working groups and in a house association. There is no caretaker, no property manager, and the residents themselves are responsible for maintenance and cleaning, administration and renting, but also for the common spaces, as well as for social and cultural affairs. And according to the statutes, every resident is obliged to dedicate 30 hours volunteer work to the Serai every year. And not all residents can fulfill these hours, and there is also the possibility to pay for these missed hours with 20 francs per hour. But there is quite a lot of discussions, as you can imagine, behind these processes and these decisions. For being a self-managed project, the Serai is quite big. It consists of 151 apartments with 1.5 up to 9 rooms, including 11 so-called joker rooms, which can be rented for different uses and needs, such as guest rooms, but also extra rooms for families that need more space because there may be more children or children get young, or also for home office or atelier or whatever. In total, there are about 340 people living in the Serai. Nearly a third of them are children and young people living with their parents. And the Serai controls the age mix, as mentioned before, and the goal is to reach a pretty equal distribution of the age groups in line with the citywide social demographics. And this has been achieved with regard to the older people, but children and young people are above average represented in the Serai. And I think they also get more and more, I can imagine. There are a variety also of collective spaces. Among many others, there is also a so-called pantoffel bar, which is a self-managed bar that you can reach with your slippers. The idea is that you can go from your bedroom to have a drink with your neighbors. And the Serai also has commercial businesses, and when a restaurant opened in the Serai, people would rather meet there for drinks, and so this pantoffel bar got a bit abandoned. Then there were young people that were interested and went there to go there, make parties there, and then there were a lot of complaints about noise from neighbors, which led that the youngsters left this place and found another meeting place outside the Serai. So one of the learnings of this episode, that now this place is again pretty empty, is that not all common rooms are easily accepted, and that the uses in development also should not compete with each other. The second example is Solinsimo in St. Gallen. It's a self-organized house community which was founded 20 years ago by 4 women explicitly for the second half of life. And the motto is in the name and derives from the Italian words soli and insieme, alone and yet together, free and yet in solidarity. They want to combine these 2 ideas in a house community. That's their vision until today. And on these pictures we see the reading corner, for example, in the community room. This community room is also open to the public. And really something special about Solinsimo of this architecture are the generally accessible terraces, which are at the same time personal outdoor space and arcade that allows the access to the house, like you see on the picture below left. And on the picture below right, we see a situation in the Corona early summer last year, where this architecture has proven to be very helpful. Residents could meet outside and also have a drink with each other and yet be together with some distance. Solinsimo is a former embroidery factory that was converted in a house with 17 lofts of different sizes. That's why they name it also Wohnfabrik, or housing factory. Today, 20 people live in Solinsimo, 14 singles, 2 couples, and a mother with a teenager, because also here we can tell interesting stories. So Solinsimo had to face a surprise in the very beginning, as one of the residents got pregnant pretty late, and suddenly in this housing project that was actually thought to be a house for the post-family phase or children-free living style, a child was also growing up. So in the beginning, this also led to some tensions, And today these discussions are forgotten. I think that the young man is pretty well accepted. The apartments are in home ownership. The common areas belong to a cooperative of the residents. This is also quite special, this financial model. And in contrast to the Serai, the residents in Solinsimo want to live together without being obliged to do voluntary work and without fixed rules. And therefore they, for example, also hired a caretaker for cleaning the common spaces. As you have seen, these two projects, they are really quite different, and I chose them just to show you the wide spectrum of possible realizations. And one thing that all the documented housing projects have in common is that they have been built with architecture that is fostering a community, which means, referring to the architects of Christiane Feuerstein, an architecture that is oriented toward people and their needs, and that translates social needs into physical spaces. And what is specific for most intergenerational housing projects is that the ratio of private spaces is reduced in favor of common spaces. And usually there are quite diverse community spaces and facilities. People often meet at spaces and niches in between the private and the public, like staircases, entrance areas, pathways. And therefore it's important how these places are designed to make also people feel at ease. For generational living, design for all plays an important role, which means barrier-free spaces, of which not only people with mobility impairments and in old age can benefit, but which are attractive actually to all generations and all ways of life. There are various architectural elements that can promote contact between people. Here just go through a few. For example, here we see so-called Allmennräume, or spaces for the commons, from the Hunziger Areal, a new development, large development in Meereswohnen, it's called, in Zurich. And when it's about shared collective spaces, there are also special cases, such as cluster living, as here in this floor plan in Kanzleiseen. This is also a 50-plus project in which small flats and studios with a kitchenette and own bathroom are combined into one larger unit with generous common living spaces. And very often community rooms have a little kitchen area, and on the picture on the right you see photos from a housing project, the Cartago in Zurich, which was planned also out of social utopian movements. A very interesting story also. And they've said, we don't want to cook everyone always by himself, and they decided to make a collective kitchen. And they also decided to have a professional cook, so that they don't need to cook, but someone would cook for them. And they wouldn't need to argue also about who is cooking today or tomorrow. Another architectural element to promote contacts are visual connections and split levels, or also arcades, as I already mentioned. It's all elements that connect people and places. But how do people deal with differences in intergenerational living projects? That's what I wanted to ask myself. And we are still in the middle of our research, so I can really share with you here just the few first insights. In general, we can say that these houses are heterogeneous in terms of generation, but often rather homogeneous in terms of lifestyles and socio-economic backgrounds of the residents. Unless there are also projects that really say we don't want to have only our bubble, and they consciously are looking for other people and also reserving maybe apartments for other people. Especially in larger projects, it's quite common that the distribution of age group is steered, and projects also sometimes hire professional community workers to moderate these community building processes. As we have seen in the Serai, self-management can be quite challenging in larger projects, or also when many residents in responsible positions are aging together and have less energy for an intense commitment, as has been, for example, the case in Kanzlei Seen in Winterthur. In Serai and Solinsimo, there are also different understandings how self-management should look like in the projects. If there should be obligations that can also be monetarized, such as in the Serai, or if everything should be absolutely on a voluntary basis, as in Solinsimo. And when people develop a housing project from the bottom up, this automatically also goes along with disagreements on specific topics, or if everything it's never like that everyone has the same opinion, no? And this can lead to long discussions and also to conflicts. And in this regard, communication and conflict culture are key. In the interviews that we carried out so far, some people told us, for example, about also that I found quite interesting, really quite deep divisions due to the COVID pandemic, as some residents did not agree, for example, with the measures of the Federal Council, or had other opinions or other ideas, and tried to convince their neighbors, sometimes also with unsustainable informations. And the people that told us, we don't know if we can bridge these divisions. Also now, if things loosen up, we don't know if we manage, or if some of us need to move out of these projects. And in other examples, people told us also about professional approaches in which they really try to deal with conflicts in these self-organized structures. Some, for example, are working with methods of sociocracy, or others offer residents they offer them courses in non-violent communication to really also learn how to speak in a constructive way with each other. And as mentioned in the beginning, the concept of good neighborliness is linked to specific ideas about solidarity and mutual help, which the projects try to implement in promoting intergenerational contacts. Expectations such as older people caring for kids, or younger people supporting older people, however, are not always met in everyday life in these places. In general, it can be said that building solidarity networks are easier with people of the same life phase, or people that share other similarities. And even if the architecture and the planning concepts in the housing projects are important, it is always about relationships between people. And often it's more important whether these people like each other or not, than to which generation they belong to. It's also interesting that many people move or would like to move into intergenerational living projects because they wish to be at home in a supportive setting in old or in fragile age. And from the interviews that we conducted so far, we noticed that many projects do not yet know how much or how long they would support a person in fragile age, for example, if someone gets dementia. So there is an ambivalence between the desire for support and the actual possibilities. It's an ambivalence which is rarely openly expressed in the projects, but which resonates also with the fact that the self-help among neighbors really has its limits. Also due to the importance of the distance as the other side of the coin in neighborly relations. So to conclude and wrap up, I tried to do both research projects together. It's an absolute first. I never did that. So there are specific ideas about living together that are materialized in built collective spaces. And these ideas are steered by social measures such as community work or self-organized bottom-up participation. In general, we can confirm that differences usually lead to more distanced neighborly relations, and community-oriented architecture and facilities, as well as socio-cultural activities, can contribute to bridge these distances. But to give and receive solidarity and help, people usually go to neighbors who are closer to them, such as relatives or friends who live close by. This has also been written in many studies on neighborhoods. For neighborliness, both is important, closeness and distance. And with regard to this dual character, spaces where one can retreat and be on his or her own are as important as spaces for encounter. And this is also the case in the co-living projects, as for example Solinsimo, that also even puts that in their name. From the children in Good and Telly, we can learn that a light-hearted approach to differences is needed if we don't want to reinforce or essentialize differences where they might be not of importance for the understanding of each other. By focusing on common grounds and common interests, living together is facilitated. And in large housing estates, residents often also appreciate the optionality that you can but don't have to have contact with neighbors. The co-living projects that often go along with a greater social or value-oriented homogeneity, and also with stronger expectations towards mutual intergenerational help. In this regard, they can also lead to more pronounced conflicts. And from the theory, we know that with closer neighborly relations, there are also more potentials for frictions, which, however, can also be used creatively if it's accompanied with a constructive communication and conflict culture. There is also the saying that frictions can cause warmth. So I want to conclude now and say thank you so much.
Thank you, Eveline, for your insightful presentation on urban living and diversity. And also, I think it's not easy to stay focused on research in this challenging times. So I really appreciate your work for this conference, and many thanks to the public for attending this today's event. So I will comment and ask some questions with a focus on three major issues. So research, background and positionality, then research methodology, and finally some insights for future research. But before I start, I'd like to say that I found a lot of food for thought in the presentation, and I'm very curious to read the final outputs maybe next year. And I'm happily surprised to see Ponticelli as one of your project case studies, because Naples is my hometown, so I would like to know more about it maybe later. Okay, so my first point concerns the research background and positionality. So the background of the three case studies was very clear. But I would like to know more about how and why did you choose these case studies? I mean the Swiss cases, and also could you tell us more about your positionality as a researcher and potentially basis in the research? So how did you influence the study? Next, regarding the research methodology, yeah, you said your project started in 2018, 2020, and will end in 2022 and 2023. So you did most of your research during the pandemic. And yeah, so how has this challenging period affected your research methodology design and planning? And yeah, what strategies did you implement to complete your fieldwork activities on time? Do you have any advice for researchers dealing with challenging fieldwork, such as tools or tricks? And finally, I'd like to raise briefly some issues. Okay, so you often use the term community in your presentation, quoting Tanis at first, and then you specified that you go beyond the neighborhood concept as social spatial entity and a local community. Indeed, citing Martin Albro, you argued that there is a coexistence of innumerable individual realities and social figuration in the neighborhood. And in the following slides, you keep using the term community when talking about neighborhood spaces and or activities, but probably you refer to community as fluid, changing, and hybrid character of group identities and memberships. So I wonder if the way you use this term in your research might be close to Talia Blokland's conceptualization of community as urban practices or performance. Yeah, in particular, Blokland said in her latest book that we are the primary agents of community and belonging. And yeah, even though we cannot exercise this agency on our own, and she said belonging does not happen to us without agency. So first, I wonder where you stand on this statement, and then regarding the coexistence of differences in the neighborhoods you analyzed, who are the actors who exercise this agency to foster coexistence? For example, what about local associations? Then another interesting point concerns the issue of mobility and city rhythms. Indeed, multi-local experiences and relationships are challenging former partners of migration and sedentarization. And today we observe people who are more and more mobile, and we often hear about faster lifestyles, acceleration, etc. But at the same time, we also see people trying to slow down, and we hear discourses on degrowth and so on. Also, yeah, some authors, such as researchers at EPFL, for example, are studying life rhythms in cities, and I think we can say that there are cities where different rhythms of life coexist. And yeah, in this regard, I wonder if you have investigated this dimension, so the differences in life rhythms in the neighborhoods of your projects, or perhaps indirectly observed practices related to this topic. And yeah, in particular, I think it might be interesting to observe this dimension on an intergenerational level, and yeah, namely the difference in life rates between people of different generation and how these elements affect coexistence. And yeah, also it could be worth to look at the challenges of coexistence between people who spend most of their time in the neighborhood and those who are dependent on activities outside the neighborhood. So in this case, the city of Bern, Winterthur, etc. Then, okay, yeah, from the pictures in your presentation, I perceived the outdoor spaces in the neighborhoods you studied as, you know, spaces that foster encounters and peaceful coexistence. But yeah, at the same time, some researchers observed that these outdoor public spaces are sometimes negatively perceived by people in some contexts. For example, yeah, some French cité, or even in my hometown, Naples. So, you know, these spaces are at the same time everyone's and no one's. So they have little intrinsic guardianship, and are therefore susceptible to being taken over by activities considered by some residents as undesirable. And so, yeah, based on your field work, what factors make these spaces feel safe for inhabitants and also for people passing by? And yeah, you also mentioned the role of caretakers and cleaning staff, the role of school in the neighborhood. But what about, for example, social workers? And yeah, finally, my last point is on digital platforms. This is probably not your focus for this project, but have you considered investigating the role of social media networks, such as Facebook or WhatsApp, etc., in this large-scale housing estate or co-living neighborhoods? They were often the only way to meet virtually during the pandemic. Even between people living in the same building. So, and yeah, this topic then generates questions about how different generations use social networks. And yeah, I wonder if this topic came up during the interviews or observations. And yeah, that's it. I hope it's good input for you, and now maybe I give you the floor for some answers.
Yeah, you were very kind and you sent me these questions, so that's why I didn't write now. And just a question regarding time. How much time do I have? Because I can get more or less into deep. What is more or less my time frame?
You have to finish at 7 o'clock. So.
At 7?
Yes. But you can put 5 minutes more.
No, that's okay. Is there any other program point? Do I have quarter of an hour, more or less, or?
Yeah, maybe just a little less. So if there are anybody in the audience who have questions or comments.
All right. So I will just.
If that's possible.
Yeah, of course. Okay. How did we choose these case studies? I think for the PUSH project, it went a bit in an unconventional way, because we are like part of a larger international team, and they came to us, I think, from the Danish team, and I don't know how they got to know this telly, and they were really interested in this telly, and I said, look, I already did my PhD on this. I would like to do another one, and that's why we are the only one that have 2 case studies, and all the other have 1. I think that's a bit also how it can happen in the research. But why did we choose then, why was Tele so interesting to them? It was because mainly also because of the architecture. A lot of them are also from the architecture departments, but also because of this ownership structure that is, as I explained, so with also these institutional investors and home ownership. And then we were choosing another example that has mainly non-profit organizations, as the overall topic is social housing. In Tele there is not a lot of social housing as intended in other things, so for me it was important. And Charnergut is mainly cooperative, and Unia also a housing, a labor union owning these things, so this was important. Maybe, I don't know, in the co-living project we went completely, we really did the triple process for the sampling of we first did this broad inquiry, and then we did bringing it down to 19, and now we'll bring it down to 6. And there we really had also sampling criteria that we were choosing regarding the size, different sizes, different age of projects, different orientation also. Are they how do they understand themselves? Different also geographical regions. For instance, now we will also do 2 case studies in the Romandie, the mixage in Crissier and the Centre intergenerational in Meunier. And yet, I think this is more going to the book, how you could do correct sampling. Yeah. Positionality. This is a really important question, and also the biases that you might have. We are working mainly with qualitative social research methods, and also my colleagues have anthropological backgrounds with whom I am working closely together. So I think one key thing for us is really to be curious and to listen, really try to listen to people, and then to understand them within their own logic and within their own reality. So in this regard, all the interview partners are experts of their own reality for me. And as a researcher and a writer, my role is then to bring a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different narratives and logics in one narrative, which is a text. And also reflect this in bringing it to theoretical knowledge, to conceptual knowledge, knowledge from other research. And I think, to me, it's extremely helpful to work in a team also regarding biases. For instance, in the PUSH project, we also really, in the beginning, were speaking together openly. What are my prejudices about these places? What are my ideas about these places or values? And I think this can help. And I think what is also a bias is just this case study approach. This allows you to really get into this setting, but then you might maybe sometimes also don't see anymore the larger picture. So it's always what we choose in research gives us then a special vision. Yeah, and what is also interesting in the international project, we first I think was the idea to do a direct comparison of the estates, and then we decided no, we can't do that. And it also came strongly from the Italian team that said, we have so other realities here, other forms of poverty, other forms of exclusion. We don't want to put ourselves in the situation to compare ourselves with this rich Swiss or welfare state Scandinavian cases. It's not from an ethical point of view to this estate that we are looking. It's somehow not right. But this somehow then also limits our maybe what you can say. I think that's from this point of view. then about the pandemic, researching in pandemic. Yeah, it really, in the PUSH project we started like in the lockdown and the first with the empirical work, and one of the first things we did, we were getting in touch with all the caretakers and all the owners, explaining them our research, and we were hanging in, the caretakers helped us to hang in every house a little flyer with we set up a number and asked people that they could either text us or call us, that they can get in touch with us. And we were also writing new little articles in the neighborhood newspapers. So the text didn't really work, but quite a lot of, especially older people, called. So it was really then also about finding other people, and yeah. We could, for this we were also working together with the community centers, with the caretakers, with the property managers, with people that told us other people, and I think that's how we got quite good sampling. Most of the interviews we were carrying out via telephone and via online or online conference tools. But we also went to the place and met people outside, especially in summer months. I think we could do that, especially for people for whom maybe some language barrier, that they don't speak mother tongue German. It's really difficult to have an interview in another language on telephone. So yeah. And we originally planned to do workshops with people on site to like do this knowledge production together with the people in meetings, workshops. We couldn't do that, and that's why we started to look for other things like the school projects that we did, or we also were introducing a letter projects of kids from Ponticelli and kids from Telly, and we were together with the community center Charnergut, we were like launching a photo competition with actually really good prizes also. We did some fundraising for the prizes, and we did a photo exhibition. So it was really to try to find out other ways of doing research here. I don't know this book by Blokland. But as you describe it, it really resonates with me, and of course I stand with that. And you ask also which actors actually do really foster coexistence, and I would say now, apart from the residents, it's the housing managers, the caretakers, the community workers, the social workers, the representatives in the urban planning offices and social departments. And that's why for us it was important to really include all these different perspectives also in the interviews. And local associations you mentioned also, that's absolutely, it's really, I think they can play an very important role also regarding sports, but also leisure or religious or political associations. Yeah, I think they are really important. And then the different life rhythms, no? That's an interesting one. And I think it's also really often related to work shifts, but also to personal preferences. And it can lead to neighborly conflicts, of course, especially regarding noise coming from other apartments when some people make noise when other people want to sleep. But also an interesting thing in these places is different understandings of families, how long children are allowed to play outside. This is, and there are really fights about this then, because some kids are allowed to play football until 11 o'clock in the evening, and others at 8 o'clock have to sleep, so yeah. And regarding generational differences, I think we can't really generalize and assume that similar rhythms for similar age groups. I think also older people don't have the same rhythms. in another research project, I once wanted to do a focus group in the morning with a group of older people, and several told me, "No, come, it's too early. I'm sleeping usually at this time. What are you working people want?" So I think it's also one of these, being aware of assumptions that maybe are different. Yeah, and about these public spaces, I think I also wrote you, what was really, really mind-opening for me was walking these estates together with the researchers from Napoli. And they really, for example, they let me know about the closeness of cleanliness and control that can also have quite an effect. It's like in Napoli, in this estate, there are quite a lot of problems, and for example, rubbish would stay a long time on a square, like in Delhi it would be away in the next half an hour probably. And I think in Switzerland it's really these caretakers and this cleaning that can also nearly get to a mania. I think also with the grass cutting in these estates, it's amazing how it's always What is an issue, I think, is that there are very limited free space for young people, because there is also control from the houses. There are very little places where young people can maybe also, when they meet at hidden places. Yeah. And the digital platforms, they play a very important role. Also before the pandemic, and it's often used in neighborly relations. I think as a tool to when do we meet. It's not like a separate thing. It's like the digital tool is used to meet on site or to organize when do you can I bring you my kids or whatever. Yeah. And I think we can't anymore say that old people are not anymore on these digital platforms. It's really changed, I think, in the last 5-10 years, that also in these neighborhoods, also in the intergenerational neighborhoods, a lot of or projects, a lot of old people are absolutely in these WhatsApp groups. And maybe just one little last thing, this email lists are important in these self-organized groups, and they can also quite lead to conflicts. Someone is writing something maybe just quickly, and then it goes to all the group, and maybe if this something is hurting someone or is, then it can lead to long discussions. So it's awareness how to use these tools is something that is, I think, especially in these intergenerational projects, quite a topic. Also older people that are really sending a lot of things in these WhatsApp chats. I don't know if you also have examples like that in your personal WhatsApp groups.
Okay.
Yeah, I think, I hope I replied more or less. Yeah. Good.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Eveline. Thank you very much, Nerea. Maybe I'll just conclude by asking if, I'll just get closer to the mic, if anybody has any question or comment on Eveline's presentation, that would be the good timing for that.
Yeah.
Sir, please.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I had just one question. Did you notice some kind of difference or influence of population density on the presence of these projects? Because I'm wondering, for example, the projects that are not intergenerational by intention, in parts of Switzerland that are very populated, like for example Geneva or Zurich, would they still keep this proportion, or do people with time get pushed out and the demographic changes?
Are you speaking now about this intergenerational projects, or about which?
I mean both of them. I was interested in general more.
I hope I can reply to. I hope I understood well. your idea is how this social mix is steered, or I don't I'm
Yeah,
not
so
sure if I understood.
yeah, because you talked about these social mixes in these projects, like
Mhm.
the projects you explained to us.
Mhm.
But I wonder if are these projects like only present in very controlled environments, or in a place where there is a housing problem, like big cities? Do they still manage to keep up the social mix or not?
Ah. Yeah, they actually, let's start with the intergenerational project. It depends, but if they are led by a cooperative, they very much do, because a lot of cooperatives have also, they say, if there are more than 3 people in a room of 3 flats, you need to be at least 2 people living in there, and if you are not, you go out. So it's really controlled. And also in these estates, it's controlled when people move in.
Okay.
I think that's why the housing managers play such a crucial role, because they really try to, in their policies, of putting people in the flats, to get a social mix. I think one reason also why is not like a concentration of one national group is because it's really steered by the housing managers that say we don't want more than 10 Turkish families in this block, and then it can also get quite difficult, because sometimes in their discourses then the migrants are the problematic ones, and they want to put as much Swiss people that they perceive as non-problematic in these estates. I mean, this is in their discourses, it's often perceived like that, but this leads also to the fact that it has quite a social mix. I don't know if I could reply to your question.
Any more comments or questions for Eveline? If not, then all we have to do is to thank you again for coming, each and every one of you, and we hope that we're gonna see you again on the next conferences. Good evening, everybody, and thanks again to you ladies.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.